Hello there, this is Ashley Dawson. This is a series of video conversations that I'm putting together as a feature link to my book that is just out, People's Power, Reclaiming the Energy Commons. And today I am very fortunate to be joined by Craig Morris, who is an advisor at Germany's Agency for Renewable Energy, the AEE. I'll spare you my not very proficient German attempt to articulate that in German. Craig has a long and distinguished history as a policy advisor and journalist in Germany. From 2016 to 2018, he was a senior fellow at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany, where he investigated the flexibility of nuclear reactors in combination with wind and solar power. He is also the co-author of Energy Democracy, which is a history of Germany's energy transition, the famous Energiewende, as a kind of grassroots movement, and that was out from Palgrave Press in 2016. He also served as technical editor for the 2014 and 2016 editions of the International Renewable Energy Agency's REMAP publication, and of the 2015 edition of Greenpeace's Energy Revolution. In 2008, he co-founded Berlin's PV magazine, and in 2010, Renewables International. In 2012, he became lead author of the Boll Foundation's EnergyTransition.com. Since 2002, he has also authored articles and books in German and served as editor for numerous German periodicals in the energy sector. In 2014, he won the International Association of Energy Economists Prize for Energy Journalism. So in sum, a very distinguished figure. It's really great to be in conversation with you, Craig. And just before we switch into our conversation, I should say that Craig tweets at ppchef, C-H-E-F, and also has a really great podcast on community-based energy, renewable energy, at the AEE. And I'll post a link for that on the website. So
Great.
Welcome, Craig. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. So I thought it might make sense to begin with a very wide open conversation for people who are not in the middle of all of the policy dynamics, just to ask about what people mean when they say energy democracy. That's the title of your book. What were you getting at when you wrote a book with that title?
So it's basically kind of two things, but I should perhaps preface this by saying that energy democracy, to the extent it is a buzzword, is really not very well defined. So the first aspect of it is that with the sort of dawning of the age of renewables, more people, from homeowners to communities and neighborhoods and municipalities, have the ability now to make a lot more of their own energy. And this is fairly new, especially after the push towards large centralized central station energy systems in the 20th century. So that's just a refocus there, where more people are able to participate in the energy sector and make their own energy now that we have wind, solar, and biomass, let's say. The second aspect of it, though, is simply sort of the right of co-determination. Okay, so we have had for a long time, especially sort of in the mid 20th century, sort of post World War II, a lot of infrastructure projects were decided by experts, and it wasn't until maybe the 70s and 80s that most countries began to have a kind of process where they would sort of get public input and try to get public buy-in, right? And so that's kind of where we are now, is this convergence of the public simply being able to co-determine how a project is developed. An infrastructure project could be a pipeline, could be a road, could be a wind farm, right? Could be a nuclear reactor in some countries. But the public is engaged in the policymaking there and in the development of the project. That's the one side, and the other side is just wind, solar, and biomass.
Okay, so that's a very significant transition away from what was essentially a kind of monopolistic structure of energy production in the early 20th century, towards something that can have some kind of consumer impact or, public determination. And obviously there are a lot of very strong movements around public power and the fight for public power. And I think Germany's been particularly exemplary in that regard. Could you talk a little bit about the sort of idea of grassroots movements and Germany's energy transition, and what role grassroots movements had in making the shift to renewable energy happen?
Well, you used the word monopolistic, and I might almost want to throw in the word technocratic in a way that's equally as important here. I think what we have learned in Germany is that sometimes the people know better. And if you go back, the sort of history of the Energiewende, this German energy transition, the term itself is coined in the late 1970s, and it's the title of a book from 1980. And basically, people were, sort of the alternative thinkers were saying there is a different way, and the experts were saying, no, 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 that doesn't work. And what we have learned over the past few decades is that this sort of the grassroots movement, people trying to get things done themselves, and the alternative researchers, they turned out to be right. And so that's why I think the word technocratic is really important there, because we have to understand. I mean, you're sitting in the States. You can hear from my accent that I was born in the States. I think there's a debate going on in the US right now about accepting facts and reappreciating the experts. And I kind of come into this debate with a difficult message. The message is that actually we're all only experts in a very small range of subjects. And the world is very complex. And when you hand things over to the experts, and you don't get this public sort of buy-in, the experts aren't able to understand how this will be perceived, what some unintended consequences might be that they weren't anticipating. And so that's why we need this kind of grassroots input. And in Germany, to come back to your question, that sort of the way this got started is that people basically said, in a conservative rural community, okay, so this was not leftist Greens, they said in the beginning, we don't want to be industrialized. You're planning to bring in, the top government is planning to bring in a nuclear reactor and some industry firms to buy all the electricity. And we think there's a different way. And because they were a farming community, they set about to start actually building these things themselves, putting up their own small wind turbines back then, building mostly solar thermal, so for hot water. And this sort of gained the momentum that we see today. So really, the grassroots movement has proven to be correct in Germany.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great point. And looking back to that history of resistance, and it's very interesting that it's a resistance that's kind of based in rural areas and not necessarily seen as progressive in any particular way.
Yeah.
Because renewable energy at the moment in the US, of course, is stereotyped as something that goes along with Volvos and latte drinking and that kind of thing. But, if we look back at struggles
Which it isn't everywhere, right? I mean, I don't want to bang on this drum too much about, how different the United States is today. But a lot of things are politicized in the States these days, like wearing a mask. And that was one of the things that I've always really tried to communicate over the past 10, 15 years to the United States from the German perspective, is that there is genuine buy-in over here across political parties, specifically with renewables, because it's good for rural areas, right? And these are the places that are falling behind in globalization. The big cities are winning. And allowing, if you have a city like Frankfurt and they surround themselves with villages that ship in the renewable energy, then Frankfurt gets its green energy, but the surrounding villages get income and respect from the big city dwellers.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. And, I think there's a parallel in the US, of course, with the struggles in the 1930s to get rural areas electrified, something that the big kind of technocratic, to use your term, and monopolistic so-called public utilities refused to do because it didn't make sense for them economically. So it was up to FDR's New Deal administration to set up the rural electrification association to bring that energy out. And in the course of the research for my book, I actually talked to some people in Jackson, Mississippi. I know you're from the South.
I went to high school in Jackson.
Wow. Okay. So I'm sure that there's a lot of interesting political struggle going on down there with Cooperative Jackson. I spoke to folks with this organization, One Voice, who were fighting against the kind of takeover of these rural cooperatives by kind of good old boy, wealthy white CEOs and shareholders, so that the majority population, who are so-called, owners of the rural associations, were paying high rates for electricity that was still completely fossil fuel, and they had absolutely no genuine say in what the associations were doing. So I think coming back to your point about energy democracy, it's so clear, that these questions of democratization of social structures and governance of energy really are intertwined in many ways.
Yeah.
Could we talk a little bit, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of the technical issues, but I think the way in which renewable energy increased in such a very impressive fashion in a relatively short amount of time in Germany is something that we should discuss a little bit. From your book, my understanding is that this had to do with a policy called Feedin tariffs, and that policy has been now significantly sidelined in Germany. And so could you tell us a little bit about the history of feed-in tariffs, why they worked, why they were dismantled or sidelined, and what's happening in terms of Germany's energy transition now?
Well, basically, feed-in tariffs more or less are kind of an arranged price schedule. So if you think of something like Medicare, for instance, there's all kinds of different health services you can get. There's different medicine you can get, and so I'm gonna say the government as shorthand for whoever does the negotiating, but someone representing sort of the insurance side of Medicaid sits down with the healthcare providers and says, what's a fair price for all of these different things? And it's going to be hit and miss. You're going to overpay here and underpay there. That doesn't matter so much as long as at the end of the day, the hospitals, stay in business. The doctors and the nurses get their pay. It's good pay, but also it's affordable for everybody who goes into the healthcare system to get services. And so these are arranged prices. Okay, that's what I'm trying to get at. And the feed-in tariffs are that principle applied to renewable energy, right? So if you put up a wind turbine this year, you can estimate roughly what that wind power is going to cost. If you put up 50 wind turbines this year in a particular area, that may be because of economies of scale. It may be slightly cheaper than just one turbine. The same thing with if you want homeowners to put solar on their roofs, but you also have some big project out in the desert, but you want both of those things to happen. Well, the solar out in the desert in California somewhere, maybe that's going to cost 3 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas the solar on these roofs is going to cost maybe 10 cents. And then you might think, well, why do I want to have the 10-cent electricity? Well, maybe it's because those arrays don't take up any space, right? So they take up no land. I mean, I don't want to get too much. There's reasons to do that. There's reasons that justify 10 cents versus 3 cents. But the sort of magic of the feed-in tariffs was that they tried to go in and say, okay, what's the right price for all these things? And they gave a 20-year time frame of these fixed prices. And what this did was it took the risk out of the investment and the banking side of it. Okay, so a profit was not guaranteed, right? So if you had bad weather and you just didn't get the sunlight or the wind, then you weren't guaranteed to return a profit, but you had a good chance. And that drove down bank loans, the interest rates on bank loans, because the risk going forward was very easy to calculate, right? And when there's low risk, the banks come in and say, okay, we'll give you a good interest rate because the risks are low. And so that made renewables cheaper, right? But we got to the point where it became difficult because there was just this price, there was no like cap. And they tried to go in and say, well, let's have this much built every year. And they came up with a way that kind of works. Actually, it's worked okay. But the problem that I think the policymakers had and the energy sector had, the grid operators had, was that you couldn't really say how much you were going to expect, how much wind and solar to expect next year, because everybody was building it. Now, from the climate perspective, that's what you want. Everybody's building it, it's going real fast. But from the perspective of the companies that are managing the grid, maybe also from the perspective of policymakers who are worried about spending too much money, too soon, they were like, we need to get better control of this. And so they switched to auctions, which, funnily enough, they provide the same sort of planability that feed-in tariffs do. The price is fixed for 20 years, for instance. The difference is that it's not sort of the government or somebody representing the government that sets the price. The government comes in and says, we want maybe 200 megawatts of wind built, and then they take bids, right? And the bidders then say, one guy says 5 cents, the other one says 6 cents, and so you take the 5 cents, right? That's the principle there. And so in auctions, you really got control of how much could be built. The problem is that we actually are like, after the first few rounds, the market has really lost interest and the prices have gone back up. And so you have rounds of auctions now for wind power where you say, let's have 200 megawatts, and you get bids for 120, and the prices are pretty high, right? And what's happened is the community groups have disappeared. And the reason the community groups have disappeared is, I'll make this short. If you're a big developer, you have 10 projects this year, you bid a bunch of them, and if you get 5 or 6, then you've got enough work to do. You lose some, but you win some over here. A community project, if you lose your bid, you only have one idea, and it's taken you a while to get your neighbors involved and set up this campaign. If this thing gets blocked at any level, then everybody goes home frustrated. They don't have 6 irons in the fire, and if they get 3 of them, they're happy. They've got 1 iron in the fire, and if they don't get this through, they are going to completely give up on the political system. And we're losing the sort of climate sort of mitigation efforts at the grassroots level by doing that, which is really bad. But it's the signal that we send out to these citizens that your input is not wanted. Let the professionals take over here. That's the thing that I think is poison for this idea that I'm trying to make everyone aware of, that we can now become more involved in the energy sector than we have been in the late 20th century, for instance. So right, that's kind of where we are today.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. And thinking about this question of engaging people in the process, from a U.S. perspective, some of the most active organizations in trying to promote renewable energy transition on a local scale, through cooperatives and community-based power, have been environmental justice organizations, right? Because those are the organizations that have seen the adverse impacts of historical forms of citing of toxicity in their communities, but also of climate change, right? So they understand that they are the front lines in terms of the kind of failure of mitigation of climate change. But for them, the issue is also an economic one, right? Who is going to benefit from good green jobs?
Exactly.
Is it going to be some big corporation that's going to try and bust the union that's, setting up the green energy? or is it going to be produced in communities that have been marginalized economically and have been dealing with, incredibly oppressive policing? I mean, the movement right now for Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States is, I think, a very intersectional movement. And I think the kind of element of climate justice and environmental justice is a really important one. And we've seen organizations step up around those issues. In some of the research I was doing looking at Germany, though, it seems like the cost of energy became something of a hobby horse for the right wing, for the AfD and other organizations that were saying, the average person is getting gypped by these high prices, and investments can be done by elite bourgeois people, not working class people who are just seeing higher energy bills. So, how is this shift played out politically, and how do you see people opposing that kind of faux populist argument by the right wing around energy?
Well, I mean, we have an episode on that, episode 5, and I'm not even sure that it's a faux argument. We have to. I kind of cringed when you said the right wing over here, because the AfD is practically irrelevant in politics. The pushback that we got around 2013 was more from the pro-business community. Okay. And I think that they're not real happy about the AfD either. I think it hurts Germany's, Germany wants to export products, and this doesn't kind of fit with those sales. There was a unique situation in Germany that cannot really be replicated anywhere else anymore. Germany built a lot of wind and solar sort of pre-2010, 2012, when especially solar, but wind a little bit as well, was way more expensive than it is today. Okay, solar, for instance, was as much as 10 times more expensive, and Germany built massive amounts. No country faces this today. Like, you can just look at the news, look at the energy news, and you'll see report after report about wind and solar are found to be the cheapest source of new electricity in Vietnam or whatever, and that's why they're, not going to develop these coal plants, or they're sorry they started developing them, right? So the cost legacy that Germany faced is actually real. It's not just a slur campaign, but it's related to the fact that Germany just started so early and made this commitment to bring the prices down, which in the end happened globally, but we're carrying that cost burden forward because of the 20 years of the feed-in tariffs that I mentioned before. So you will hear up until about 2030, when this cost burden will taper off very quickly, that the prices of everything, electricity over here are very high. It's just because Germany did the right thing and jumped in and said, all right, it's expensive, but if nobody builds the production lines, the costs are not going to come down. So I think it's a good thing. I mean, look, I'll make the social side of this pretty quick. We say this in the podcast as well. If you want to deal with social impacts of something, use social policy. If energy policy or climate policy has some negative impact, but it makes sense in terms of what you're trying to do, like energy and climate, come in with social policy and help those detrimentally affected. Okay, if energy prices go up, go in and do something from the social policy side. You don't need to do social policy through energy and climate policy.
Right, that really makes sense. Yeah, and thank you for clarifying about the different political forces at work in Germany. I wanted to pivot a little bit to ask you about the political forces in the US, and how, from where you sit in Germany, with this history of a successful transition, you might imagine things happening in the United States. Obviously we are way behind with very little renewable energy in the grid, despite renewable portfolio standards and other efforts to goad the big utilities into energy transition. Here in New York, we've got a much ballyhooed renewable energy transition, but we still have very small percentage of actual modern renewables in the grid. And actually, our mayor has been talking for the last 6 months or so about using renewable energy to run municipal buildings in the city of New York, which is a significant amount of power. And he wants to get that renewable energy from big dams in Quebec,
Hmm.
which are likely going to be built in indigenous territory. So there's a lot of political contention in the US in general right now around the way forward for renewable energy. And it draws in these kinds of intersectional struggles that I was referring to earlier. There's a very vibrant campaign right now in New York for public power. And it basically, has to do with building out the New York Power Authority, which was set up during the New Deal, and doing kind of end run around the existing public utilities rather than trying to goad them into doing the right thing, because they resist it so adamantly, and it's very hard to municipalize them and take them over, as has been done in some parts of Germany. So what do you see as the way forward in the US? Hopefully we'll have a new president, but energy is controlled largely on the state level or on, levels of certain public utilities within states. So it's a complex picture. How does one reconcile all these different levels and really make the fast transition that we need to renewable power in the next decade or so?
Well, first of all, the United States has amazing potential for wind, solar, in parts also geothermal, um, biomass, by which you need to understand bio waste largely. Okay, we're not talking about necessarily expanding a lot of crops, but we've got a lot of even municipal waste that can be used for energy purposes. Germany's doing it. So, I mean, Germany has really bad wind and solar conditions, and they're still making this transition. So there's so much. The U.S. is in a much better position in that respect. The problem that I see, and I'm thinking of like videos I've seen by maybe Robert Reich. There was another one, I don't remember if it was like John Oliver or somebody did one on corporatism. I'm remembering one video where they basically showed that, you think there's a bunch of different glasses makers, but it's actually 70% of the market in the US is all one company that's trying to look like 8 different companies, even with eyeglasses. Um, Really, the sort of corporate monopoly structures that are prevalent in the US, that's really what needs to be overcome. And you can start to do that at the municipal level. I know a lot of my friends and relatives in the States are, kind of dismayed at what's going on. A lot of people have lost hope in the federal government, but most people engage at the community level. So you can, start becoming involved in your local government and just try to kick off one project, get your neighborhood project going, something like that. Um, if I answer in a more general way, like if there's going to be a green stimulus or something, right? Um, some kind of post-corona green stimulus, maybe. I think if you ask most people that question, they would say we need to build this much solar. We need some kind of alternative fuel for airplanes. These kind of technical things, and that's the technocratic answer to it. Okay, let me give you an energy democracy answer to that question. What I would do if you said, Craig, here's the $1 trillion or whatever it's going to be, do something with it. I would say, I'm not the dictator. I would start to have citizen assemblies like in Ireland, like the one that just finished, I believe. We got some results in the press this week in France. Okay, so at the end of June, the French sort of citizen assembly for climate policy has just produced, I don't know if it's the final version of everything, but they produced some recommendations. And we've seen that at the smaller level as well, but the Irish and the French cases are now the 2 biggest ones that have come across my radar. Really take a look. This stuff is online. Just type in Citizens Assembly Ireland Climate or something, and take a look at their recommendations. They are wildly more advanced than anything our politicians would dare to do, because the politicians fear public backlash against, really radical proposals. But this is why I'm so convinced that, people can solve this problem. If you get a group of citizens together in a citizens assembly and you give them the resources to discuss and learn more about the topic, they will they begin inviting in the experts, listening to them genuinely with an open mind, and talking with each other, eye to eye, and they will come to compromises, and these compromises again will be very advanced, and we've seen that over and over and over. So I don't know what I would do with the trillion myself, but I would basically say, let's set aside some of that money to create this citizens assembly, have the people educate themselves about these things, right? We have a democracy in actually in most countries, but also in the States, where people vote on things they don't understand because the world is so complex. So citizens assembly basically says, no, no, we want you to learn, like do a crash course on this. Okay, so you get paid to take time off work, like jury duty or something. You talk to whatever experts people agree to invite in, and at the end you come up with these proposals, and then you can give this to the government, and the government says, okay, we got $1 trillion, here's 13 proposals, let's get started. And that would get you going really fast.
I love that idea, and obviously it's very much in keeping with the framing of my book around the energy commons. But my previous book was called Extreme Cities, and so I looked at planning around climate adaptation in various different cities. And one of the things I produced coming out of that with the Climate Action Lab that I founded was a People's Climate Action Plan for New York City, because we really concluded, very much in line with what you're saying, that it's people in hard hit neighborhoods, people who are affected by Hurricane Sandy here in New York or Katrina in New Orleans, who really understand the dynamics at play in their communities and are much more likely to come up with forms of climate adaptation that they're going to be able to buy into, that are actually going to work, and that are going to be facilitated, through collaboration in various different ways, rather than just sort of imposed from above and technocratic and a failure, as happened with the levees in New Orleans. So I love that idea of citizen assemblies, and I'll definitely look it up. I wanted, with the last question, to shift a little bit to thinking about renewable energy transition in the global South. And I do that for a couple of reasons. First of all, there are fast developing countries like India that are electrifying a lot of the population, hundreds of millions of people. And unless they go down the renewable energy route, the amount of carbon emissions are going to be really disastrous for the world. Obviously, the problem is that rich countries like the US have not pioneered the way and are not showing a good example to those countries. And there's a history of climate reparations that we should be thinking about, because we put so much carbon into the atmosphere. So, what might a kind of transition for the global South look like, and what do those of us who live in the global North owe to countries in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia or other parts of the world that are developing, and how could this be a global process that involves real sort of questions of equity, which I know you've been so concerned with in your podcast?
Well, what do we in the global North or global West, whatever it is, owe to the global South? Our prosperity. Um, we're talking about energy today, but we've been exploiting their resources for centuries. And I also meant to look up legacy emissions before having this talk, but I forgot to do it. But you can look this stuff up online as well to get an idea of, like, out of the carbon that's in the atmosphere today, how much of it is from your country, how much of it is from the EU and North America and stuff like that. And it really relativizes all the talk about China and India and everything else. It's basically our problem that we've caused. So I would people watching this video, if you don't know about the legacy emissions thing, just look up like historical carbon emissions or something. For the global south, I'm not an expert on the global south. My feeling is that in most countries, um, you know, these people are also not stupid, and um, they're quickly discovering that wind and solar are the cheapest. So the transition is going to happen there. Where I see the obstacles is where you have carbon resources in the ground. So countries like Germany, but also South Africa, that simply have a lot of coal that they should step away from. Or even Norway. We don't talk about Norway enough. Norway has a lot of oil, and it continues to open up new fields. It's going into, I think it's the Barents Sea up in the very far north. Um, we always talk about their 100% green power and the 20 something percent electric vehicles and whatever, these amazing numbers, but they're funding all of that by exporting oil. And the trick is to get all of these countries, Norway, Germany, South Africa, to just step away from these fossil assets and say, we've got to leave it in the ground. And that's really where I see it. For me, I don't think it's so much a global south problem as a problem of what countries, some of which are in the global south, need to leave it in the ground. And how do we finance that? Because Germany has actually, Germany's criticized because it's agreed to step away from coal by 2038. And everybody says that's too late. But it is, I think it's the first country that has stepped away from fossil in the ground and said, we're not going to dig it up. Okay, so there's also that aspect to it. But Germany can afford to do it, right? They're putting their ethical foot forward. I've been to South Africa. My daughter did a year abroad, her gap year there in Transkei, one of the poor regions. So I have a little bit of an understanding of the fact that you could use these fossil resources in South Africa to develop the country. I think these are really harder issues. We go into those places and say, yeah, but solar and wind, and it's easier in places that just don't have the domestic coal, right? The domestic resources. And I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's my sort of answer to what do we do about the global south. It's really, for me, it's not the global south. It's really what countries have resources, carbon they need to leave in the ground.
Thanks. That makes so much sense. A hard issue, but the lens that you're approaching it through really makes a lot of sense. Well, I'm sure we could keep going for a long time. It's so wonderful to be in conversation with you, but I should probably let you go. Thank you so much for speaking with me. And I just want to close by, again, appreciating your podcast and saying that I will include a link somehow to it at the end of this video, so that people can follow your work as well as following you on Twitter through @ppchef.
Excellent.
Thanks again, Craig. Great being with you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay.